personally, I think SBG is more than just martial arts, but martial arts is a big part of SBG, and the journey of SBG, I think, starts with your journey, your personal journey. So I want to ask, what did initially drew you to martial arts?
Good question. I'm not quite sure. So there were different incidents that occurred to me in school, but the reality is, the further back I go, from the moment I remember being aware of the existence of martial arts, I was fascinated by martial arts. So the first time I saw martial arts magazine in the library, I would always go to the library and, read them in the library. First time I saw a martial arts book, first time I saw a Bruce Lee movie, I remember that distinctly. It was on a black and white television. And I believe it was what in America is called Chinese Connection, where he fights all the Japanese guys.
Mm-hmm.
And I was blown away. So my fascination with martial arts goes way back.
Mm. Would you say that Bruce Lee was your inspiration to try JKD to begin with?
Yes and no. Yeah, probably was the first thing that gave me an indication of wanting to do that. But the reality is, once I discovered I wanted to do martial arts, my dad eventually put me in karate, but it was a very traditional kind of karate. And I knew even back then, and I was probably, 8 or 9, that this is not it. Mm. And I was always interested in what works and what doesn't work in a fight. My dad's a police officer. He was a police officer in a small town, so he had been in plenty of physical confrontation. So I would constantly ask him questions. And I was always looking in martial arts magazines. And in the martial arts magazines throughout the late 70s, I think Bruce Lee died in 1973, I think. So throughout the mid to late 70s, and especially the very early 80s, there was a lot of Dan Inosanto and Larry Hartzell and people like that were in the martial arts magazines. And the philosophy that they were advocating, I've talked about this before, but the philosophy that they were advocating was a kind of a utilitarianism, where they talked about needing to be in all 4 ranges and using what works. And they basically, Bruce Lee had paraphrased a quote from Mao Zedong, which is absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. And that made sense to me. The utilitarian part made sense to me. And as I got a little older and I got into junior high school and I started to get in actual fights, I had been in fights where I'd been tackled and had somebody mounted on me and sitting on my chest. And I've been in headlocks, all the basic Gracie in Action 1 material that you see when you're in a fight as a kid. And so I knew that in addition to striking, I needed grappling. And because of my dad, and my dad was a boxing fan, and I grew up watching boxing and watching Larry Holmes, who was the champion throughout much of my childhood, I kind of knew that the way to go as far as striking was boxing or kickboxing. So I had this idea in my mind that I need to do boxing or kickboxing, not karate. But I also have to be able to fight on the ground, because these guys can just tackle you. And the only thing I saw in the martial arts magazines at the time which had any resemblance of reality and that claimed to be doing that was Jeet Kune Do. So the moment I was out of the Army, which was I was 21 when I was out of the Army, I immediately began looking for a Jeet Kune Do school.
I think your story is well known for your critical thinking towards martial arts. And I think from what I know, it started from becoming, I guess, disillusioned by Jeet Kune Do. And if that's true, then what started to give the impression for you, or what helped you to understand that it's actually not what it's claiming to be?
I gravitated towards Jeet Kune Do because from what I saw in the martial arts magazines and the literature at the time, it seemed to be what we would later call mixed martial arts. And so from a pretty early age, from my teenage years, I kind of knew that I needed to learn mixed martial arts. Didn't exist at the time, but I understood you had to be able to fight at all the different ranges. And the big thing about Jeet Kune Do was they would talk about having to fight at all the ranges. I never did understand, even back then, where the Filipino martial arts aspect of that fit into it, other than, okay, so you also want to be able to fight with edged and impact weapons. But I gravitated towards Jeet Kune Do. When I got out of the military, I trained with an instructor named Mike Packey, who was one of Paul Vunac's first instructors. And Paul Vunac's tapes had just come out, I think, in Panther Productions. And Paul's a pretty charismatic guy, and a lot of what he was doing, especially in those first tapes, made a lot of sense to me. It looked like MMA in many ways. So I trained every day with that guy for hours every day. That's all I did, because I was working at a job and just training. And that lasted for a while, I think a year and a half, almost 2 years. And then my job moved me up to Portland, Oregon. And so I drove up here to Portland, Oregon by myself in a car, and immediately started looking for another Jeet Kune Do school. There was none. There was nothing in the phone book. So I started putting out flyers to put together a training group. And the only reason I was going to start teaching Jeet Kune Do under the permission from my instructor in California was because I needed people to train with. And circumvent a long story, I ran into a few people. I ran into some students of Steve Golden, and Steve Golden was actually one of Bruce Lee's original students. And I did not like what they were doing. What they were doing was basically just Wing Chun. And the first thing I did when I got to Portland and realized there was no Jeet Kune Do schools was I signed up at a boxing gym called Grand Avenue Boxing Gym. So it was a legitimate pro amateur boxing gym. And I was boxing 5 days a week. So Monday through Friday for 3 hours a day after work, I was in the gym. And when I went and trained with these guys, these Steve Golden guys, I knew right away that they would have no answer if somebody were to throw even a single punch. So it was obvious to me they weren't doing something realistic. And eventually somebody answered my flyer who was an instructor under Dan Inosanto. And I went and met these two guys. One's name's John Daniel, and the other one's Chris Clark. John's still here in Portland and a friend of mine. And they were doing the very typical Jeet Kune Do concepts curriculum under Dan, which is they'd have Muay Thai, then they'd have what they call a Jun Fan class, which was more Bruce Lee's martial art. And then they'd have a lot of Kali, and then they'd have Silat, because Penjak Silat had become kind of the new magic bullet for Jeet Kune Do at that time. And I was super interested in the Muay Thai. I was interested in the Jun Fan to the degree that it resembled kickboxing, and I was interested in any grappling. So I started training together with them. Eventually, Chris opened up a school. I became kind of the main instructor for that school, and I was teaching the boxing and kickboxing. And on Friday nights, I got my own class. That was my class to do whatever I wanted with. And in that class, what I did is I had a core group of maybe 15 people, and we got random sports equipment, used sports equipment from everywhere, motorcycle helmets, lacrosse gloves, like you name it. We kind of used a mishmash, catchers, shin guards from baseball, put them together and basically just sparred. And during that time, I think I taught there for about 2 years. I got to meet Dan a few times and hang out with him privately. I got to meet a good percentage of the Jeet Kune Do full instructors, from Chris Kent, Burt Richardson, Richard Bustillo, Larry Hartzell. Some of them I liked more than others. I liked Larry a lot. He was a very sincere guy, and I trained with him after I opened up SBG and brought him up a couple times. I liked Burton a lot. Burt and I became friends, although he hadn't quite had his revelation about martial arts at the time. I liked Richard Bustillo a lot. Richard Bustillo was very practical. But a lot of what they were doing was bullshit. There's just no other way to put it. And there was a definite hierarchy. And amongst that group, what they were interested in clearly wasn't what I was interested in. I don't want to be too negative about it, because it's really easy for me to go down that road. But the most generous thing I can say is they were not interested in fighting. They were interested in collecting certificates and kind of advancing up this hierarchy to see how close you could get to Dan Inosanto. And your worth or value was kind of measured that way. And none of them were really fighters. And I would see privately, Dan say things to them like, you need to have a bodyguard, or get somebody in here who can fight, so if somebody comes in and gives you a challenge match, they're the ones that do it. And if when they were doing the demonstrations, and the demonstrations were always 1 and 2 step sparring, it was a dead pattern. It's exactly what Bruce Lee was advocating against, was 90% of the training. And if you resisted, or the uke resisted at all, then they'd like hit you in the nuts or do something to try and make it work. And the whole thing was backwards. So as I was there with them, I started to become more and more cynical, and the philosophy that ultimately became the original philosophy, the founding philosophy of SBG really was a counter philosophy to all the hypocrisy I saw in Jeet Kune Do. And, you know, just to give me an example, the big thing was Penjok Silat at the time. And the reason why it was the big thing is because Dan Inosanto had a quote in a martial arts magazine: whatever Dan Inosanto trained is what they wanted to train. And he started training with a guy named Paul de Torres, who was a pot-bellied guy that wore a funny hat that did goofy martial arts shit. It was kind of like Sistema, honestly. And he had a couple other brothers that also did martial arts. And he came up a couple times. I liked him. He was nice enough. But obviously, to me, it obviously had nothing to do with fighting. And the reason why they were into that is because Dan was doing it, and because Dan had a quote in a martial arts magazine where he said Paul de Torres was the most dangerous man alive. And for that reason, like, they had to learn the secrets of Penjok Silat. And it was obvious to me there were no secrets of Penjok Silat. I think Paul just made that shit up when he got to the United States to teach it to credulous Americans. But I befriended a guy named Stephen Plink, who was Paul's #1 instructor. And they were all kind of in awe of Stephen because he was Paul's #1 instructor. And he was very honest, and he was very sincere, and he was not a phony. He really believed what he did worked. He was also Army Special Forces, so we kind of got along because I had just gotten out of the Army a few years ago. And we became friends. And I would sometimes take his class, but not really. But before the class, was kind of funny, is like you'd have all these guys waiting to learn the next form, because Silat was taught in a series of forms, literally, that you had to memorize. And he would show me like the secret forms and say, you know, how he wasn't going to show it to them, but it was all really silly. I think one of the fighting stances was squatting on the ground with your feet crossed and your arms crossed. Like, if I was going to design the worst way you could possibly defend yourself, I couldn't come up with a goofier way. The kicks were like, if Mr. Bean was making a movie about how to do kicks and it was just a joke, and you're like, what is the most ridiculous way we could possibly try and kick somebody? Okay, let's stand on all fours and kick this way, or let's flip our foot this way because there's actually no biomechanics and it won't hurt anything. That's how they kicked. The whole thing was silly. And the idea was, it was so dangerous you had to shadow spar, which meant you sparred like 8 feet across from each other. So one person would make a move and then you'd be 8 feet away and you'd pretend to counter, right? Mm. So it became really, really silly. And around that time, and I'm terrible with exact time and chronology, it all kind of blends together for me over the years, but somewhere in there, I met Fabio Santos. And that's kind of the story I tell over and over again. My main coach has always been Chris Haueter, but Fabio and Hickson always come up because they were my introduction. What everybody always asks is, you know, how'd you first get introduced to jiu-jitsu? But around that time, I met Fabio. I knew instantly, this is what I'm looking for. It was not make-believe. There was no dead patterns. He was like, just try and beat me up. It's a 40-something-year-old man that was about half my weight. And so I started doing jiu-jitsu every single day. I trained with Fabio when I could, which was only a few times, but got some mats immediately and started trying to work the material. And Stephen Plink was actually interested in that. And eventually he stopped teaching at my friend's school and started teaching out of his garage. And I would go to his garage and show him some jiu-jitsu. And he'd try and figure it out, because like I said, he was pretty sincere. But it was really after meeting Fabio and seeing jiu-jitsu and then seeing where everything else was going. And I remember being out at a dinner one time with a lot of Inosanto's instructors, and the conversations were always about other people and who wasn't in the clique or who was, and it was always just goofy gossip. It had nothing to do with fighting or training. And there was one guy there who was from Canada, who was one of Dan Inosanto's full instructors from Canada, who then made a point of saying how he was keeping files on those guys. Yeah, I keep a file on those guys. And every time they put something up, an ad, that I put it in their file. And I remember sitting there at the dinner thinking, what the fuck is wrong with you? But as I'm thinking that in my head, I can see that everybody else at the table is like, oh, that's a good idea. You're keeping files. And I knew right at that moment, I'm like, this is not my tribe. These are not my people for whatever reason. We're just not interested in the same thing. So I went off and opened up my first school, which was, and I didn't want to compete directly with my old school, even though we did not really have a good parting of the ways. I didn't want to compete directly with them, so I opened up a place in Kaiser, Salem, Oregon, which is about 40-minute drive for me. So I would work graveyards 10 hours, and then I would drive 40 minutes, do everything because I was the only person. So return all the calls, do all the paperwork, teach every class, and then drive home. And I did that for a couple of years. And that school, which was very tiny, it would be the size of, an apartment, blew up. And the rest is history. A lot of people wanted to do what I wanted to do. A lot of people really did want to train real martial arts, so this whole thing they had about compromising themselves so they could make money, that turned out to be bullshit too. They didn't even need to do that if they had just been honest. But I had discovered that so many of my students were driving from Portland. And in the interim, after I left that school, my friend went out of business. So I just opened up a second school in Portland. And SBG kind of blossomed from there.
Was it straight blast gym from the get-go when you...
It was. It was. So when I first opened up the school, I was like, at first I was thinking, okay, I'm going to call it Northwest Martial Arts Academy, as generic as you can get it. But as I started to think about it, I started to realize I want to, and this goes back to wanting to, the early philosophy of SBG being basically a counter philosophy to Jeet Kune Do concepts. I wanted to differentiate myself from what they were doing. And what they were doing is they were calling themselves institutes or academies and collecting certificates and play fighting. And I wanted to, my idea of a school was you're going to come in, you're going to be wearing sweats or whatever you work out in. You're going to wrestle, you're going to box. You're going to actually train. It's going to be like a gym. It's going to be a gym, like my boxing gym that I was still going to, every week. So I said, okay, I got to call on a gym. And then what's the point of the gym? Well, the point of the gym is we're going to take these techniques, we're going to take this material, and we're going to apply it under pressure and see what survives. And one of the few techniques that we still use consistently in full contact sparring that really could place its origin in Junfan kickboxing or Jeet Kune Do concepts was the straight blast. We had modified it to more of a boxing blast, which if people are wondering what that is, Vitor Belfort made it fairly famous in his early UFC debut, but it's basically a running series of jabs and crosses. But that we kept. And so I said, okay, so we're using this technique and we're doing it in a gym environment. So I'm going to call it straight blast gym. And then later on, that just became SBG because I guess it's how people remember it, but that was it.
It's kind of interesting now that you said it. It was almost, I can't find the right word, but you almost kind of foresaw the future because these days MMA are MMA gyms, or I guess sometimes Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are more academies or gyms, but it almost seems like you kind of guessed the right concept for the future.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is I'm not, as you know, a believer in the supernatural or anything like that. But when I first arrived to Portland on my first or second day, I went downtown Portland for the first time and I got a coffee and I was thinking about, my mind was constantly thinking about martial arts. That's one of the reasons why I knew I had to do it for a living, because otherwise I'd just be doing another job badly because I'd be thinking about martial arts while I did my other job. But I was sitting in there having a coffee and I was envisioning my ideal training environment. And this would have been the 80s, right? Or like 1990 at the latest, maybe. And I was envisioning people with gear on, fighting, and going to the ground. I was basically envisioning MMA is what I was seeing in my mind. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And that was before I'd even seen Fabio or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. But yes, I, for whatever reason, was blessed early on with knowing exactly what I wanted to do, which I think is, I see a lot of young people struggle not knowing what they want to do, and then they worry about it, or they go into college and they don't know what they want their major to be and things like that. And I could see how that can be stressful, but for me, for whatever reason, I just never had that issue.
Also, you mentioned that it's chronology is not your strong suit.
Not my strong suit.
Right. But is there any chance you'll be able to remember where and when I'm trying to remember now the name, it just slipped my mind, your video lessons? It's the
aliveness videos?
Yeah.
Yeah. That would have been, I don't know. To be honest with you, I'm trying to think. It was after the first UFC, so it was after the UFC had started, and so it was after. It would have been after Randy Couture made his debut.
So it was
MMA fans will be able to nail that down. It was within. I made those videos probably within 6 months of Randy first making his debut in the UFC and winning the title. He came into my gym, and then maybe 6 months later, we were shooting the videos because people were asking about aliveness. So whatever year that was, if you guys look that up, when he won the first, and it was a tournament, I think he had to fight 2 or 3 guys. That would have been around the time that we shot those videos, and they came out within 3 months of us shooting them.
So that was already like somewhere down the line. It wasn't in the first few years of SBG.
No. No, I already had a pretty good group at that time, and my students at that time were capable of fighting in there was only a few. There wasn't really a lot of jiu-jitsu tournaments, and to compete in jiu-jitsu, you had to go to LA. There wasn't any of that here in the Pacific Northwest. There was no MMA in Oregon. This is another long kind of funny story, but many years ago, they took, I don't know if he was a former gangster or just a snitch or somebody from the East Coast on a witness protection program related to the mafia somehow. And they gave him a job in the government being the head of the Boxing and Wrestling Commission of Oregon. And he was a complete asshole. And he got paid whatever it was, some 6-figure income to do nothing. So no matter what you called to do, you wanted to have amateur boxing, you wanted to have golden gloves, professional wrestling, let alone MMA, just no, fuck you, no, and he would hang up the phone. It later became kind of a controversy when people figured out who he was because he was so awful to deal with. But because of that, there was none of that in Oregon. There was no boxing, there was no wrestling. But fortunately, 5 minutes across the river is Washington. And in Washington State, you had Matt Hume, who really is a pioneer of MMA. I don't think he gets enough credit for how big a role he's played in the sport. But the very concept of stand-up clinching ground is something that Matt was on years before I think anybody else was. And he had produced a group of really good fighters like Superman and, gosh, this is where my memory fails me, Josh Barnett, a bunch of really good guys up in the Seattle area. So my athletes would occasionally fight those athletes in what they would call pancration events, which is kind of like MMA, but you usually slap the face and there was no gloves in Washington on occasion, or the occasional MMA fight. And my early group of students were competitive. They didn't always win, but they were competitive. So, we were on the right track when I met Randy. And Randy came into my gym, I think, really because I was the only MMA school anywhere. And he knew that his next fight was scheduled to be Vitor Belfort. And he didn't know jiu-jitsu. He had no jiu-jitsu really prior to walking in my gym. And so he came to me to train to learn how to defend against jiu-jitsu. And it was maybe a month or 2 months after that, somewhere in there, that we filmed those aliveness videos.
From what I hear, MMA was quite different back in the day, especially in terms of how it's taught. Could you point out like how the MMA game changed in your own environment?
Yeah, it was way, way too rough. So if you go back and look at and I'm still to this day a little bit, remorseful about that. But if you go back and look at my first video series, the training on the series, even some of the fight scenes you see in there were way too violent. And in particular, the jiu-jitsu was violent. It was rough. It was fast. It was with all our attributes. We were doing everything kind of wrong. We had technical jiu-jitsu, but we were training in the wrong way. But the head contact in particular was way too much. There was way too much head trauma, way more than was necessary. But the only thing I would say in my defense is, rewinding the tape back then, A, I was still in my mid-20s. I was a young man. And B, there was no MMA. There was no MMA gym. So, my role models for how to coach, really my only real role models, because it certainly didn't come from the Jeet Kune Do community, my really only role models for how to coach were boxing coaches. Because I hadn't even, when I first started my gym, I hadn't even had much exposure to wrestling coaches who, in my opinion, are more technical as far as coaches. But it's not to say boxing coaches aren't technical, but the route you go through if you walk into a professional amateur boxing gym, the coaches that are there generally are there looking for a prospect. They're looking for somebody who's going to do good. And so they basically just try and weed you out. They're going to make you work super hard, and they're going to put you in with somebody that can hit really hard. And they're going to see if you come back the next day. And if you come back the next day, then they'll start to sharpen up your tools a little bit. But the idea isn't to teach boxing to everyone. The idea is to find the next Mike Tyson. And that was certainly what happened to me when I walked into the boxing gym. So for me, I still had this idea that making people better involved constantly testing them over and over again in ways, including myself, but in ways that were way too rough. And that's not what we do anymore. So our training methods have changed dramatically. And I still hear, occasionally I'll hear some of the older guys from my generation lament the loss of that and talk about how jiu-jitsu's become watered down. And to some degree, jiu-jitsu has become watered down, but that's not why. It's not because the training has gotten far better. The jiu-jitsu's become watered down, quote unquote, in the sense that there's a lot more schools that focus solely on tournament fighting. So they gear themselves towards IBJJF, and as a consequence, they've taken out what was the majority of what we did back then, which we would call Vale Tudo, which was jiu-jitsu when somebody can hit you or kick you. But the training methods aren't something to look back on with nostalgia. The training methods we used were way too brutal and unnecessary. So now, as you know, we have a very different route. And it's not to say MMA is still not very hard. I mean, you're fought at, and you trained at John's gym, and he's certainly at the top of MMA schools in the world. It's hard, but you're not just getting beat up every day, right?
Yep.
Not the way it used to be. So we've gotten a lot better.
I personally have the impression that, or I'd like to think that SBG is at the top of the game in terms of teaching methodology, and there's like a lot of emphasis on the teaching methodology. So how did that come to be, and how did it start, and how it evolved?
Yeah, so that goes back to my early fascination with the question of what does and does not work in a fight. I was completely absorbed by that question for whatever reason, from a very, very early age as a young boy. And I kept with that. And then I think when it dawned on me, it was really kind of just a light bulb moment, but the idea of aliveness, that what distinguishes martial arts that work and don't work isn't necessarily the technique, but it's the training method. It's aliveness. And if you have aliveness and you train with aliveness, you can make almost anything work. And if you don't have it, you can have a very functional system, but it'll deteriorate rapidly into just nothing more than a dead pattern. And there's no better example of that than to contrast, for example, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu against traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, as it's very often taught in the United States. One, many times they'll have the same movements. They'll have the same arm locks and takedowns. But on one hand, you'll have somebody who's dangerous. And on the other hand, you'll have somebody who, as you know, like a 3 or 4 stripe white belt can usually run roughshod over a 2 or 3 stripe black belt in traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. That's aliveness. So once I figured out aliveness, then my mind kind of it wasn't so much fast absorbed by what works and what doesn't. It was now more about, well, how do we capture the best practices for aliveness? Because it can't just be this rough, like just throw people in the swimming pool. And that was also when I first started talking about aliveness, from the moment my videos hit the market, and then some magazines came out, martial arts magazines came out, things like that. The main question I would get and the main retort people would have was, well, that's just how we start, and eventually we do, you hear this in Aikido, of course, right? That's just how, and then eventually, it's never eventually, of course. But the other side of that question is a kind of an accusation of, well, you can't just throw people in the pool and people will get hurt. And so I would find myself having to explain the process that we use. And say, well, actually what we do is we show them a technique, and then we practice the technique, and then we add adaptive resistance, and then they get in the pool. And in the process of actually articulating what I was doing at the time and what I was learning to do at the time, we came up with things like I method and all the other, the 5 types of drills that there are. Those kind of things came as a result of trying to put to words and codify what I was actually doing every day on the mat in my job. And it's just something that I'm fascinated by. And a lot of the other instructors in SBG are the same way. They're deeply fascinated by training methods and how to make people better safely. And that's kind of, as a group, what we're all about. So if you're the type of instructor who's just like, well, just do it, and not put too much thought into how you train, or you just train the way your instructor showed you and you don't bother to really explain it or try and improve it, that's okay, but you're probably not going to rock the SBG method or find yourself feeling real comfortable in a room full of SBG instructors, because that's not what we're about.
Before I forget to ask, so in regards to origin story of SBG, gorilla is the symbol of SBG. But till today, I actually don't know the story behind it.
I get asked that a lot. And people will also send me over the years, their reasons why they think it's that way. I've gotten books. The Story of Q was one, Connections to Evolution. But it's nothing that well thought out. It was an accident. So basically what happened was I first come up with the name Straight Blast Gym. This is going to be the school. Well, I have to make my first ever Straight Blast Gym shirts. And I was looking for a cool graphic. And I was flipping through a wrestling magazine, a collegiate wrestling magazine, and there was an advertisement in there for ear guards. And it was a picture of a silverback wearing ear guards. And I thought, that's a cool picture. And so I had one of my friends who's an artist draw it in pen and ink, and that was my first shirt. We actually have that on the website, I think. And when we did the 25-year anniversary gis, I think we sent out a little certificate that explained where the gorilla came from. But that was it. And then from that moment forward, obviously people liked it. And then from that moment forward, people would give me gorillas or draw gorillas. And so I got lots and lots of them. And then I had a student who was a fighter of mine, Native American fighter named Ewan Moore, who one day drew the gorilla arms crossed. That was his drawing. And then he would airbrush, and he did a giant one inside my gym in Salem. And that became the logo. That just became kind of organically what everybody recognizes the gym for.
Did you personally later add some significance to it, like put more thought in what it represents for you? Or because I could I created so many stories in my mind as well, like what it represents. So
I think in many ways it does fit perfectly with the gym. And so whatever stories you come up with, they're probably true in their own way. But I will say that the first version of that gorilla arms cross had the anarchy symbol on its chest. And the anarchy symbol wasn't politics. I've never been an anarchist. The anarchy symbol was about, again, a counter philosophy to Jeet Kune Do. So everything about Jeet Kune Do was, the way I saw it and my experience of it, was very phony. Like phony titles, certificates, phony training methods, mixed in with some good things, some Muay Thai or some boxing, but there was a lot of just nonsense and posturing and things like that. And so, early on, we're going to say, okay, there's not going to be any titles. We're not going to get hung up on terminology. There's not going to be certificates. None of that. Nobody's going to tell you who you can train with and who you can't train with. None of the politics that were involved. All that's going to go out the window. And I should say at that time too, there were a lot of politics in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Rorion was suing his own relatives for the use of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu name. Black belts would come up to Oregon to train with me or train at the gym and not want anybody to know. And they, in particular, would not want anybody to know if they were rolling or training with Randy, because their coach didn't want American wrestlers to learn. It was silly in hindsight, the fact that they thought that they could keep it secret. But there was this idea that we're going to compete with these guys sometime in the future, so we don't want to show them stuff. So there was a lot of politics too. Where, for example, Chris Haueter had early on trained with Hickson, and then when they broke up in the garage, he goes one way and somebody like Mark Eckert goes another way. They were training partners, but then they weren't supposed to train with each other after that, because Mark was now with Hickson and Chris was now with Higgin. And that, so at the time, I think a lot of that's died off just because there's so many jiu-jitsu instructors. It's pointless to try and control it. But at the time, that existed too. So anyway, the anarchy symbol was, you're not going to tell us who we can train with. We're going to train with whoever we want. There's not going to be any titles. I was never anything other than my first name or coach, because the concept was the instructor is going to train in class with you together. And you're going to be learning from me just because I'm a little bit ahead of you, and I'm going to be learning from you if you're a little bit ahead of me, and we're going to grow together. And so that's what the anarchy symbol represented. But over the years, there was things that happened after that, like issues in Seattle at various political rallies and stuff, and people would then begin associating SBG with actual anarchy, and then we took the A off because I didn't want to confuse people.
Yeah. Speaking of Chris Haueter, is there a good story of how you met or how your relationship began?
Sure. I had gotten my blue belt from Hickson, and I had gone down to compete in a tournament. Let me see. I think I'm trying to remember if I met Chris before or at that tournament. I don't remember, but I think it was before. I had gone down to train. Maybe it was. Anyway, I'd gone down to train in Hickson's tournament, and Hickson had become very hard to train with. He had started fighting in Japan. He'd become famous. You know, I've told the story before about the first time I trained with him. There was probably only 20 or 30 people in the room. And he went from that to being probably the most sought-after martial arts instructor on the planet, where if you would organize a seminar, 1,000 people would show up. And not to mention he was making a lot of money fighting in Japan. So he just wasn't around. Like if you go to the school, there'd be Luis or there'd be somebody there, but he wasn't really available to teach. And I needed someone who could come to Portland. I needed somebody, because I had little kids, 2 little boys at the time who were very, very young. My youngest had just been born. And I couldn't come and stay in LA for a year. And I didn't have the money to move. Anyway, I wanted an instructor to come to Portland, to come to my school. And it was around that time that Bert Richardson and I had become friends. And I had talked to him about aliveness and introduced him to Randy. And he'd come up several times and train because he wanted to learn clinch and train with us. And he would show me stick fighting, and we got along very good. And he told me about this guy named Chris Haueter. He's an American black belt, speaks perfect English. You would like him. He doesn't put up on any of the bullshit. He'll show you all the details. I'm like, cool, introduce me. So when I went down, and I believe it was for that tournament about a week before, I met Chris for the first time on the beach. And I asked him a question about an armbar. And he grabbed whoever, I think it was Burton or somebody, grabbed whoever was there with me and just went through all the details of an arm lock. Like, here's what your heels do. Here's what your knees do. Here's the point of where your hips are supposed to be, all that kind of stuff. And I'd never heard that level of detail, ever, from any of the Brazilian instructors. And that's probably on me. I don't want to blame them for that. There's a language barrier at the time, and then there was also just only so much time, right? And you can't show a white belt every detail in the world at once. But Chris was very open with the knowledge. He didn't keep secrets. And he was only a few years older than me, and we kind of liked the same music and stuff like that. So I immediately gravitated towards Chris. His schedule was open, so he would come. After that, he would come and stay with me for a week, 2 weeks at a time. He'd fight. He'd get on the mat. He was just like the rest of us. He'd get on the mat with Randy or Dan and have a 45-minute roll. He would do MMA. He would do Vale Tudo. He was 100% on board with what we were doing. So Chris became my instructor after that. We actually both competed in that same tournament. I competed as a blue belt, and he had a match with Clever Luciano, who's a very good jiu-jitsu competitor his weight, as a black belt, which I think he lost on advantage or sweep points. But that's how Chris became my instructor. And for years he would come up and I would either go down there. Mostly he came to Portland, and he would come several times over the year, 3 or 4 times a year, and stay sometimes, weeks.
I'm curious also to ask, was it challenging for you to be so much on your own as a teacher, because Chris wasn't always around and there was no one else like a higher level above you in Portland?
Yeah, yes and no. So if I had like early on in my jiu-jitsu career, probably all the way up to when I first got my black belt, which would have been 18 years ago, but whatever it was. I was just as interested in my own performance as I was my students, which made me not a bad coach in many ways. I was much worse as a coach than I am now. So eventually settled down and matured, and the progress of my students and my became way more important than what I could personally do. And I began taking pride in what my students could do and how well I could teach, as opposed to my own personal performance. But definitely through my 20s and 30s, I was very kind of selfish that way as far as my own game. And so I would be in every class. Now if I'm teaching a class, I'm kind of focused on the safety of the students, the safety of the mat. I'm not usually training in the class. I'm going to spend time with each and every member, make sure they get it. I train, but I'll train after or at a different time, because I'm there to teach.
Right.
Back then I was in with every class, in shorts and a t-shirt, and we were fighting every class. So had I had an instructor who was here with me, if I had a Chris or a Fabio or let alone somebody like a Hickson or a Henry Akins or somebody up here, then I would have probably progressed much quicker, and I'd have a lot more details a lot sooner than I did. But that said, there is I believe a massive advantage on being on your own. When you're on your own, you have to learn how to teach. You have to come up with your own training methods. And if you're somebody like me that likes that process and is fascinated by that process, it forces you into doing something that you already want to do to begin with, which is think about and refine training methods and ideas and games. And so in one way, I actually think it was good for me. And SBG, while I would have probably personally grown quicker as a coach had I had someone up here to mentor me and take me through some of the details a little faster, I think it's possible that SBG as an organization and our training methods, what we've come up with, might have not occurred as quickly, because that kind of evolution may not have happened in the way that it did because I was on my own. The flip side of that too is, and I've said this before, because people worry about this. Someone will be a student, maybe they're with me until purple or brown, and then their job takes them somewhere else. They're going somewhere and there's no school. And they're worried about their jiu-jitsu, and I'll tell them, just start a group and you're gonna get good. I do think that if you have a kind of an idea of how to train intelligently, you can get better on your own, teaching people who've never done jiu-jitsu before in your life, but taking up that responsibility and putting together a training group, than you can in a room full of champion athletes. I saw that happen with Travis when he went to Montana. When Travis left my gym, he was a good purple belt, but he was a purple belt. Moved to Montana, where there was no one who could tap him. Like, there was nobody that was better than him physically that could beat him. Took it upon himself to begin teaching and build up his own group. And I think probably ascended to a legitimate black belt level faster than he would have in my gym. Another example I've thought about before is Haueter. At the peak of Haueter's career, where he really was pretty much untouchable, he was teaching in London, and I don't think there was anybody in London that could beat him. And most of his training partners were people he could beat. But if you really understand, Hickson's idea and the core nugget again of aliveness and how we train at SBG came from Hickson. If you understand Hickson's concept of how to handicap yourself intelligently when you're working with other people, you can get very, very, very good working with a white belt or working with a blue belt, especially if you're teaching. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Speaking of stories, is there one you like to tell most of about Randy, your relationship with Randy?
Oh, I have a lot of Randy stories. First time he came in, he was definitely, he was the first Olympic level world class athlete that I ever had a chance to train with on a regular basis. And if you've not trained with somebody at that level, it's hard to describe, but it's just a different thing. And Randy was the reason why I took up weight training, and I got in shape. And you can see kind of a difference. So there's the Jeet Kune Do 1 series, where I'm kind of just natural genetics of what I was as a kind of a 240-pound heavyweight. And then the functional Jeet Kune Do 2 series, where I'm more like 270 pounds, but I probably have, 8 or 9% body fat. That wasn't me being like, oh, I want to get in great shape to look cool or anything. That was survival. Because if I had not really spent that much time taking care of my body, I would have gotten broken when I trained with Randy on a regular basis. My first ACL surgery, I've had a couple ACL surgeries, both knees, but my first one was from a takedown of Randy. And it's not his fault, and I don't want to imply that he trains rough. It wasn't that Randy was a bad training partner. He's a great training partner. And it wasn't that he was training rough. He wasn't. But you can't work with an athlete at that level and give them game, give them a lot of game, and not get hurt unless you take care of your body. This is very hard. So, or I mean, even if you're a great technician, what are you going to do? Give him like 3 or 4 minutes? I mean, he wanted to go in and work 5-minute rounds. So I had to get in shape. So that was the first thing. Second thing was, the first time he walked into my gym, told me who he was, and I'd seen his fight, and he was training Vitor. And in my mind, I was like, oh shit, Vitor Belfort, which this is kind of a funny story, because at that time there was still this legitimate aura of badassery around Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts. And that had come from Rickson. My introduction to Rickson. Rickson's like a Superman in terms of his performance. He really is a different level. And then we saw what Royce did in the UFC. And so to me, I didn't know the difference, because I wasn't down there in Los Angeles intermingling with the family politics. So to me, anybody that was a legitimate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and I think at the time even Vitor was using the Gracie name, I kind of put them in the league with Rickson. Well, he must have like this incredible game. And I think I might have been a blue belt, but I was a high blue or beginning purple at the time. So to me, I was immediately like, wow, Vitor Belfort, he's going to crush you on the ground. And we rolled, and I would catch Randy in submissions and things from the guard, because he'd never done jiu-jitsu before. Now, I would sweep him, and he would immediately get back on top. That's one thing I realized. It was almost impossible for me to get on top of him. I could sweep him a little bit, but then he'd get back on top. And very rapidly, and this happens with wrestlers, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of the jiu-jitsu black belts didn't want to train wrestlers back in the day, very rapidly he learned how to counter what I was doing, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a triangle, an armbar. There's only so many times you're going to get him, and then, man, it becomes really hard, because he knows not to put his hand there. He knows how to adjust his base. Mm-hmm. So, but because I was still competitive with him at the time there, I thought, man, Vitor's going to run him over. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I'm just blue-purple, and Vitor's Gracie's, the black belt. I had no idea that Carlson had just given him the name, and that technically Vitor was probably had a jiu-jitsu level that was probably equivalent to mine, or maybe even worse at the time, But we trained for that, and all Randy really mostly did was train on the jiu-jitsu for that. And then the one thing we also worked was, you got to watch out, because the first few seconds he's going to come at you with a boxing blast, and if he catches you with that, Vitor was a southpaw, and if he catches you with that left cross and then runs forward, he can knock you out. We saw him do it to Tank Abbott and a few other people. So my solution for Randy was to hold his hand like this. Okay, so his elbow was going to be in front of his jaw. So there's no way, just to leave it there, really, to leave his arm high, because if Vitor came in close enough to throw a body shot, Randy could use his Greco. And that would make it pretty much impossible for Vitor just to run at him with the boxing blast. That's all we did. So Randy did this for stand-up, and then everything else was jiu-jitsu on the ground. And the rest is history. What everybody saw in the world at the time, and what I saw, and I had not come to grips with at the time, was how masterful Randy was at the clinch, where the Gracies were black belts on the ground. Randy is a black belt at grappling, standing up. And I had not experienced that yet, because we didn't train clinch for that fight. He and I didn't train clinch. I mean, I wouldn't have been a good training partner other than a Muay Thai plum. I didn't really have much clinch. And he was worried about ground and stand up. he was not worried about Vitor's clinch, which we now know why. And what we saw there, I think, was the first time that the upright clinch, especially up against the cage, was used really effectively, where Greco, which is, I think, the premium clinch art in the world, was used. And I think, and from my opinion, after that fight, what Randy showed the world in that fight was everybody needs Greco. Everybody needs to train Greco and an upright clinch. His fight after that was Maurice Smith, and that was a completely different thing. So with Maurice, he wasn't so much worried on the ground. He figured he could submit Maurice maybe, or at very least defend himself well. And he wasn't really worried in the clinch. He was worried about the stand-up and getting inside. So for there, I used my boxing, and I would try and hit Randy, and he would take me down, which is kind of brutal. Fortunately, I had a boxing ring at the time, which was designed for professional wrestling, so it was very springy. I had bought it from professional wrestlers. But it was in preparation for that fight where I tore my ACL, and I realized if I'm going to train with these guys that are this level of athlete, I have to be an athlete myself. And so I kind of changed my body, quote unquote, just by really putting a lot of focus on strength and conditioning. Not strength for like how much weight I can lift, but it really was a question of survival. I want to be able to train with these guys, and for me to be able to train with these guys and not get hurt, I have to do this. So it forced me to do something I really didn't otherwise wouldn't have wanted to do. And yeah, those would be my two big lessons from him. I mean, I have lots of stories of him, but he's a very humble guy. He also made me realize how silly the street fighting idea was, and how dangerous professional athletes are, how dangerous somebody like him, who's a professional athlete who has jiu-jitsu and wrestling and some striking, how dangerous an MMA fighter can be. And, there's also a lot of lessons in terms of mindset, because Randy, I think, had a great mindset, which you could see when he would get into the cage and just kind of smile. He never showed any nerves or anxiety or fear. I know he felt those things at times, but you never saw it. He was always very calm. I think that was just part of his personality and the fact that he loves to compete, and he was somebody who should be in the cage. That's where he belonged. And part of that was the fact that he'd been wrestling all his life. So, from a very early age, whatever it was, he's used to competing in front of stadiums of friends and family. So, and that's a huge advantage when it comes to professional sports.
SBG has a lot of famous names, I'd say, throughout the history of it, and including today. One of the better known names, especially from the coach's realm, is John Kavanagh. And I heard his version of the story of how he met you, but I've never heard your version of the story. So is there one?
I'm sure that his version is better, knowing how John tells stories. But my version was, I was at a MMA fight in South Africa, and I had taken a fighter with me. Actually, Roy Singer and Forrest Griffin, I think, were with me for this fight. And I was cornering both of them. And I was also cornering one of my local, we had an SBG South Africa for a few years at that point. I was cornering one of the local guys there named Bobby. And John was his opponent. And my introduction to John was watching him walk out, I think by himself, holding a bucket, and step into the cage to fight Bobby. And I don't remember exactly how much, but I think he gave up almost 20 pounds to Bobby. Bobby was a big, strong guy and a lot bigger than John. And John put up a good fight, but lost. I think the fight was stopped in ground and pound. And after that, we hung out at if I remember correctly, we hung out at a club, like an after hours place, and struck up a friendship, started talking. He had the same interests, very similar background and fascination with martial arts as I did, had come from Kempo karate and gotten beat up and realized he needed to learn functional martial arts. And then the next day he came to meet me at the gym we had there in Johannesburg, and we trained. He did a private, and after that he invited me to Dublin. And I said, sure. So I went to Dublin for the first time, and when I was there, we trained. I made him SBG blue belt. I think he'd been given a blue belt by Hoist at the time, but he was definitely very good. And he had a decision to make at the time because he had recently graduated university as an engineer. John has an engineering degree. And his dad was kind of badgering him to get a real job, quote unquote, calling him every morning to see if he got a real job. And John was on the fence about whether he was going to do martial arts for a living. But I could tell that he loved martial arts. He was like me, and it's like if you've got an engineering job, you're just going to sit in your cubicle thinking about martial arts all day long. So I think on that trip he decided, okay, I'm going to give it a year, and if I can make a go of it for a year, then I'll try and do this for a living. And at the time, he had his first gym was also very small. It was literally a shack, like a shack you'd see on a lawn somewhere, where there was no insulation and you could see through the slats of wood, and it was freezing, and it was a bunch of really tough Irish guys beating the hell out of each other in a shack. That's basically what it was. That was John's first school. And the rest is history. He went on to become one of the best MMA coaches in history. But that's how I met him. He was an opposition to one of my fighters.
Yeah. And would you say that was the beginning of SBG in Europe, or?
It was definitely the beginning of, yeah, I would say that. I had been to Europe before that. I had gone to Scandinavia. I'd been to Denmark a few times. Trying to think if I'd gone anywhere else yet, but we hadn't opened up an official school anywhere yet. And SBG Ireland, that was the beginning of SBG Ireland. And SBG Ireland was definitely the beginning of SBG Europe for sure. And I think it was the next trip after that. I can't remember if it was the same trip or the next trip after that. I met Carl, but they were very close together when I had met Carl and John around the same time. So, and Carl had then started SBG UK. So both of them kind of started very, very close together at the same time.
How would you say most of the coaches joined in? Because SBG is so big and so many coaches are there, and so many of the coaches are still in SBG from so many years ago. So how did they usually, is there like a general way of them becoming a part?
So a good percentage of the original SBG coaches, especially in the United States and Canada, were former JKD people. And if they weren't former JKD people, they came from other traditional martial arts. Like in Kavanagh's case, he'd come from Kempo. In Carl's case, he was a fairly well-known Jeet Kune Do instructor who was in the magazines and known as doing Jeet Kune Do. And they were thinking about the same things I was thinking about. They were seeing the same hypocrisy and the same fallacies repeated over and over again in the JKD world. And what happened was, for whatever reason, when I first made that set of videos, I told the truth about some very simple things in martial arts very bluntly. And there's a certain population of people that gravitate towards that. They like that. And it's like, because when they would watch the tapes and they go, exactly, that either that's what I've been trying to say, or that's what I wanted to say, but didn't want to say it because I didn't want to hurt people's feelings or whatever it was. But it's like, that's what I mean. And because they would see that, there's a pleasant feeling that comes from that. It's like, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one that's thinking this. There's somebody else that's thinking the exact same thing, and they're explaining it in a way that's logical. And people like that. And so then they would contact me via email, or they would call the gym and they'd say, hey, I want to train with you. And they'd either come to me or fly me out to them. And that's how it happened. That's what happened with Louis Gutierrez, Paul Sharp, Adam and Roy Singer. The list goes on. Rich Bowpitt, Jason Lansuki. I want to leave anybody out. But pretty much all the early crop of SBG instructors had either seen me in the magazine or watched my videos or heard me argue with somebody online on a chat forum or something. Appreciated the logic, felt the exact same way as I did, and wanted to connect then so that they could be part of a community that felt the way they felt. And that's how it started. So, and the thing about that is what made the organization itself very strong, because the organization is a group of people who are bonded and are together, not because of a personality, not because of a famous martial arts instructor or because of a world champion that everybody wanted to attach their name to, not because they all just happen to come from the same school, not because they all happen to train the same art. They are bonded together because they hold the same values.
Mm.
And that is they hold the same values about martial arts and primarily life in general as well. And that is a very strong thing to build an organization on.
Mm.
And since that time, we've still attracted people like that. There are still people that come into the fold because of that. But the majority of our growth now is organic because we have our students. I have black belts who have black belts now. So, now the art grows from inside.
Yeah. Since I mentioned John Kavanagh, and I don't want to go too much into that realm, but I'm just curious to ask, obviously, there's Conor McGregor, and you were probably involved with the whole story of his career early on. So I'm interested to ask you, when you met or saw or heard of Conor in the beginning, did you see the potential that he will become such a well-known champion, or how was it for you initially?
I did not. So I'd be lying if I said I did. I don't have that talent. John definitely saw it. I remember, I think Conor from when I would go there for seminars and when he was younger. And I remember some of the early fights and the Cage Warriors and all that kind of stuff. But what Kavanagh does particularly good, I've talked about this before, but he can look at an athlete and he can see their potential. He can see the strengths in their game. He can see weaknesses in their game. And he can compose a strategy to counter their game. And he can do all that relatively quickly. And those aren't talents that I'm particularly good at. So, there's a lot of things involved in the job that we do that seem like they should all be related, but really aren't. And this is one of the mistakes people make, is they'll think somebody is a very good black belt, for example. You'll have a world champion, IBJJF champion black belt. And they then think, well, that person's going to be able to pass on the art. They must know how to teach. When, as I've said this many times, my experience has been they're usually the worst teachers. And then they'll think, well, that person will be able to evaluate another fighter. Not necessarily. It's a separate skill. Well, that person, they're going to be able to corner MMA, completely different sport. They may not have any talent at cornering MMA at all. The list goes on, but you have all these different magisteria that are really separate areas of knowledge. And some people are very good at one or two or three of them or okay at all of them. And other people really excel at one of them. And where John really excels is individual athletes being able to dissect their game, being able to see potential, and being able to corner. Yeah. So for him, taking, you can be an instructor in SBG and go many different ways. You can be an instructor at SBG and just have a small jiu-jitsu school where you help people. You can be an instructor in MMA in SBG and be primarily focused on self-defense and making good people dangerous to bad people, or working with law enforcement, things like that. Or you can be an instructor in SBG and be an MMA coach. And I think John, having gone the route of MMA coach, was the appropriate route for him to take, because that's really where his talent shines the most, I think.
Yeah. And coming back to SBG itself, I think you kind of spoke about that already, but to look into that a little bit more. So SBG is all over the globe. It's Korea, Africa, Australia, all over the United States. What do you think made it happen? So what keeps it such a big organization and helped it become so big?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I said before. It's a group of instructors that are bonded together because of shared values and principles and concepts. Not because of a personality. It's not because of me. We're at a point now where there are instructors who haven't really spent time with me, right? They're an instructor under one of my instructors. And that is a very powerful thing to build an organization around. If you build an organization around shared principles and values, then it's going to remain strong. So we rarely have people leave, almost never have to get rid of anybody. If we get rid of somebody, it's something serious related to ethics, that we can't have them representing the rest of the organization. But that rarely happens. And so it's a pretty pretty strong group. And that's definitely how it started, and that's why it grew. And the speed at which it grew early on was because nobody else, I just happened to be the guy that came out and said it first. Nobody else said that stuff. And so they gravitated to me at that point. Our continued growth, like I said, is more organic at this point, and it's exponential. If you're a black belt who then creates 10 black belts, and those black belts go on to open up 8 schools, and then 10 years later they have black belts, and you can see how the phylogenetic tree just grows and grows and grows. So that's where we're at this point in terms of SBG. And if they share our values and believe in that message and are integrated into the community, then when they go off and open up their own school, then they're going to want to be part of what we do. And if they don't, they want to go do their own thing, that's fine. That's fine too. But the vast majority do. And so the organization just keeps growing.
And again, you mentioned values. So what values would you in particular mention when speaking about SBG?
I think the first one is truth. So if somebody puts something in front of truth and telling the truth, and even if it's, in our case, something as banal as martial arts, they're not going to get along in the community. So what grew the organization in the beginning was me telling the truth about martial arts. And that attracted people who were interested in truth in martial arts, interested in what works and what doesn't work, interested in best practices as far as training methods, interested in improving those practices, fascinated by those things. And so that's number one. Number two, I think you kind of have to be smart. So if you're not the type of person who puts any intellectual effort whatsoever into the training methods, into what you're doing, if I don't mean smart in the sense of you have to have a PhD. I mean smart in the sense of thoughtful. If you're not thoughtful about your practice, if you're not thoughtful about how you teach and thoughtful about what you're doing with your students, you're probably not going to get along in the community because you wouldn't be as respected as you otherwise would be for putting care into your work, being a professional and taking what you do and your responsibility towards the students that you have on the mat who look up to you seriously. So that's another big piece of it. Those are the two main principles I think that glue everyone together. There are also just like being a basic good human is important. You know, if you're ripping people off or, you know, stealing or immature or run your mouth all the time, kind of, you're not going to get along in a group of men, you know. So there is a certain standard of behavior that is kind of enforced internally, and people have to live up to that standard. And that's a good thing, you know, because we want to create what ultimately where we're at now is anybody that uses the name SBG around the world, I want that to be a place where a family can go, where a woman can show up and she's not going to get harassed, or have some guy who doesn't like rolling with women hurt her, where you can take your kids and drop them off and know that they're going to be in good hands and be learning good values, the kind of values you would want your kids to learn as a parent. Those kind of things are super important. And somebody that we feel doesn't represent that is going to be somebody that we're not going to want in the gym, is going to be somebody that's going to be kind of pushed away in a sense. And that's just how it happens organically. And it's very hard to put a single word to that. But at this point, it really is kind of about, in addition to truth and being thoughtful and professional in your job, it's also about a certain level of family values represented in the gym. You know, it's going to be a place where you could bring your kids, bring your wife, bring your mom, and be proud, and they would be safe to train. And that's super important now, because one person that uses that name SBG, they represent all of us.
Very cool. And just a couple more left. So one of them is, what's next for SBG?
Yeah, I never had a plan. I never intended to start a gym. I started a gym because I needed training partners. I never intended to do this for a living. I didn't think I'd be able to do this for a living. I thought if I told truth about martial arts, I'd always have to have a second job, because that's what everybody else told me. So I was surprised that I was able to do this for a living, so that worked out well. After doing this for a living for more than a decade or so, I never thought I would be able to be successful enough to own property and have homes and do things like that. And that turned out to be wrong as we began applying best practices, not just in martial arts, but also in business. So each step along the way wasn't necessarily planned by me. It just kind of happened organically. And I think at this stage, that's how I intend to allow it to grow. So I see my goal as articulating and representing the values of SBG as best I can, about continuing to advocate for thoughtful best practices and training methods, to continue to search for those and to put those out where I find them, to catalog and gather up as much of the fundamentals of the delivery system of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as Rickson teaches it as possible, to pass that on to our members, and to continue making good people dangerous to bad people, as Paul Sharp says. And along the way, we will take new people on that come to us that really want to be part of the organization if they fit in and are part of what we do. And we will have students that go on from our own schools and take this and continue to build on it. But above all else, I think, protect the members of the community, continue to grow and advance on our own, and make sure that the next generation is better than we were. And on that note, I think we for sure have succeeded.
And would there be anything in addition if I would ask what's next for you personally?
Well, I finished a book that I've been working on for years, and so that'll be coming out at some point. We're in a holding pattern with what's going on with coronavirus and decisions to make about whether you publish a book in this environment or wait. But ultimately that will come out. I do enjoy writing, so I plan on doing more writing on different topics, not necessarily related to martial arts or even related to violence, although that's what my book is about. And I'm going to keep teaching jiu-jitsu. I plan on continuing to teach jiu-jitsu and be on the mat for the rest of my life. So I've been pleasantly surprised with the growth of SBG University. And the thing I really like about that is being able to teach jiu-jitsu and then have those lessons to where anybody in the world can go online and see what we're doing and then communicate with me. Whereas in times past, I'd have to jump on a plane, and go there and see them once a year. I feel like I have much better connection to all our members around the world now. If they want to reach out to me and be able to ask me a question or learn from what I'm doing here in Portland, they can do that. They don't have to be here in Portland. And that's huge. So I plan on continuing to build that up as well.
Actually, so that wasn't on my list, but it's a great thing to ask you about. So if you could tell a bit more about SBG University for people who, let's say, haven't heard about it yet.
Yeah. So, we have lots of gyms around the world, and usually I'd go and I'd see them once a year because there's only so many weekends out of the year I can go and travel, and got to the point where, I'm not even going to those gyms anymore. I'm just going to the region maybe once a year. And I'm still planning on doing that once the virus subsides, and I enjoy the occasional travel, and I definitely want to see everybody in person. But what I started doing a few years ago was recording my classes that I teach here in Portland. And I put a lot of care and thought into my classes, and every time I teach a class, I try and make it better than the class that came before it. That's kind of my goal. And now we're filming that, and we're putting it online. And so you can go online and you can actually see what I'm doing here in Portland, no matter where you are in the world. And then you can ask questions and get feedback from that. And, I get a lot of personal satisfaction out of that. And I find that to be very helpful because it's a way for me to connect with those people that I otherwise would only see at best, once a year. We also used it as archives for all the other, whatever it was, 600 or 700 other videos from 20 years previous of SBG. I had some instructors even that said, hey, you should only put your new stuff up on there because some of the stuff you did before, we've come up with much better ways to do it since then. And while that's 100% true, I like the fact that you can go back and you can see what we were doing in 2001 or in 1997, and you can see what we're doing now in 2020, and you can observe it's not hard to figure out the date when the video was shot and all that, and you can observe the evolution of the curriculum that way. So I think it's good, even from a historical standpoint, to have that up there, and people can see how the materials changed and evolved.
Cool. And the very last question, times are turbulent, I'd say, these days. So would you have something to say, like a suggestion, or what advice would you give to anyone who's facing more challenges than before with COVID and everything else going on?
Yeah. This is all going to pass, and eventually the virus is all going to be over, and we're going to go back to business as normal, and you got to stay strong and hang through all this kind of stuff and be there for everybody else that needs you while this is going on. That's the main number one thing you have to do. And in terms of turbulence, and a lot of that's political, that'll pass too. And I would suggest people pay a lot less attention to politics. If there's any good thing that's come out of the last 4 years, it's been hopefully that people can realize what happens in your own community, I feel, is often more important than what's going on in Washington, D.C. or whatever capital of your country is. And what happens within your own gym is a lot more important than often what's going on in the community at large. And above all else, what happens within your own house with your own family is the most important thing. So start at home with your own personal relationships, and then build out from there to your students, and put your time and energy in that, and not worrying about who said what, and turn off the television.
Yeah, great advice. I like that.